3, 2. All right, and welcome back to the Aristotle Show. I'm Dr. Feist at St. Paul University, and we're still in the politics. We're still in Book 1. Now we're on Chapter 2, but Chapter 2 is going to be broken up into a couple of videos, and Part 1 will deal with the natural pairs. And in this chapter as a whole, I'll just make a few comments on the whole chapter, and then I'll dig into the subsection that I want to talk about in this video. In this, you can think of it as kind of a story of the formation of the polis. Not a literal story in terms of like a historical development, but more of a logical story. Like, what are the parts of a polis? Remember, this polis is a special kind of koinonia, right? Koinonia is a kind of community, so there are little communities that get together, and then they form larger and larger and larger until eventually you get that special kind of community, koinonia, that is a polis, or a state, or a city-state. There's a variety of English translations for it. But the important thing is that the polis is the kind of community in which an individual, mainly an Athenian male, was able to truly become human, and in other words, to truly achieve this life that we call the life of eudaimonia. That's what, remember, the Nicomachean Ethics led up to. You can't achieve eudaimonia in a koinonia that's smaller or less complex, shall we say, than a polis. So you need the right kind of context to achieve eudaimonia. So now that we have an idea of what eudaimonia is about, Aristotle's trying to tell the context, the story of the context in which this can come about. So that's what I mean by the story or the formation. It's more like the logical structure of the polis. So you can think of it that way. So the polis is an organic composite with a hierarchy in it. So there's, lower, higher levels if you like, but they're organically linked. So the several levels can be unpacked like this. And here I give you the Becker number so you can go and have a look in the text. We start off with the small ones, like individuals. Individuals combine into pairs, and he's got this notion of these natural pairs. That's what I'm going to talk about in this video, is the natural pairs. In the part 2, still in Book 1, Chapter 2, Part 2 will deal with all the others. How the pairs combine, and you get households, how households combine and you get villages, and then villages combine and you get the polis, the big one, in which that an Athenian male, a free Athenian male could achieve a eudaimonia. The polis, then, Aristotle will talk about the relationship with the polis and the individual. So these guys I will all discuss in the next video. In this video, I want to talk about the so-called natural pairs. Now, this probably Chapter 2, well, probably Book 1, the entirety of Book 1, is the really controversial part. And there's a lot of different views as to how we should read this. Is this really Aristotle's thought? And in what way is it? Or does this deviate? Or whatever. I'll look a little bit about that in a little bit later in another video. For now, I just want to try and kind of concentrate on what he's saying, and I'm going to try and stick closely to the text and just try and unpack as much as I can in a straightforward way what's going on here. Well, Aristotle says, okay, at the beginning, sort of the logical beginning of things, you need two things to get this whole notion going. You need the two natural pairs. The one natural pair is men and women because you need creation, like reproduction. You got to get children. You got to get that going. How's that going? Well, that's a biological thing. So it starts off with biology. Men, women, reproduction, or creation. The next one is not, it's not just enough to create and bring children into the world. If you want to have a kind of polis in any way, not only do children have to be brought in through reproduction, but they have to be preserved. So you've got the two natural pairs, really, are creation and preservation. How is preservation? Well, creation is unpacked biologically. Preservation, Aristotle, it's kind of a quasi-biological notion, and it is this other pair, ruler and ruled. So Aristotle will make several arguments that whenever you have a composite, part of the composite runs the show, and part of it is that which is ruled. So leader, follower, however you want to unpack it. But in terms of preservation, to have something that's a composite that's preserved, Aristotle says part of it has to be in charge and part of it has to be ruled. So ruler rules. So there's your two natural pairs, according to Aristotle. The first pair is men, women. The second pair is ruler and ruled. Or if you like, creation and preservation. But remember, creation is a natural pair and preservation is a natural pair. So we have those two natural pairs. One cannot exist without the other. So they are dependent. So they are mutually dependent. Can't have one with the other. And so these are, if you like, naturally occurring asymmetries. There's a variety of ways you can think about it. But Aristotle thinks this is a natural type of pairing in nature. And again, the first one runs along biological lines. This is not a matter of choice. That is, men and women for reproduction. Humans are like plants and animals. They all naturally desire to leave copies of themselves. It's not necessarily a sexual desire, as in that desire for sexual contact. That's there, of course, but Aristotle is really talking about a desire that we have to leave copies of ourselves. And animals do that, plants do that, and humans do that. Now, the notion of desire has to be taken carefully because it's not always, like we tend to think of desires always as conscious, like, oh yeah, I desire something and I know that I desire it and then I know I'm acting on it. The notion of desire in Aristotle is not to be equated with that. There's sort of a fundamental, like plants have desires and animals have desires to leave copies of themselves. That's part of his biological system. That desire is important. It actually is the reason why a lot of things do what they do. We don't have those notions in biology anymore. We talk about desires in psychology, but not so much in biology. We have other mechanisms of explanation. But for Aristotle, desire was an important explanatory principle, and it wasn't conscious desire. So remember, even inanimate objects, in a sense, in the Aristotelian system, had desires, like to be in their natural places. So that was his way of trying to understand how the world operated, and as I said, desire is important too. So this is just something that we naturally desire to do, to leave copies of ourselves. So that produces the biological results. So remember that desire is a part of this, and it's shared with ants, animals, and non-human animals and plants. The same thing here with ruler and ruled for preservation. It too is natural. So what does that mean? Well, if ruler and ruled is natural and needed for preservation, then, well, in this pair, just like for Aristotle, the notion of man is a natural kind, and so is the notion of woman is a natural kind. Well, the notion of ruler, there's such a thing as a natural ruler. It's part of a natural pair. So as I mentioned earlier, when you have a composite, Aristotle says that, well, in a composite that's ordered and hierarchical, intrinsically they will be hierarchical if they're ordered and they're functioning. Well, there's going to be a part that's naturally ruled and naturally the ruler. So these two there is a thing of a natural ruler and a naturally ruled, however you want to put it. So these aren't just arbitrary, assertions. So what you want to get your head around is that the claim that what Aristotle really is saying is that there is a naturally ruling thing in the universe and a naturally ruled. So you can see where that's going when you start bringing this distinction in and start talking about humans. It's going to lead into there are some naturally ruled humans that should be just ruled, and others that should naturally rule. All right. So, okay. And that's sort of the lead into the next thing I want to mention. What's the relationship between the natural pairs, like men, women, ruler, ruled? Do we just basically map it on, like as the way I've written it would suggest, that you go, the natural ruler, it will be men, and the naturally ruled is women. And yeah, that's more or less what comes out in Aristotle's text. So the men, women is more or less related to the ruler ruled, but there's a little bit more going on in just that. So what I want to just have a look at is how Aristotle tries to justify this. He says that with respect, and I want to turn now to the ruler ruled. Aristotle goes on and he says that nature distinguishes between females and slaves. So Aristotle thinks that he's doing biology here. That he says that it's not, and he will argue this point. Like Aristotle's fully aware, as we'll see later on, that some people have said in his own time that, slavery exists, yeah, but that's largely only something that's, it's an artificial imposition. That is that the reason why some people are slaves is because of the way laws and the enforcement of those laws have occurred. And there's nothing natural about it. It's just the way it was set up. And if it had been set up differently, different people would be slaves, or maybe no one would be slaves. And so in that sense, slavery is not natural. It's just a human construction. Aristotle disagrees with that, but he's aware of that position. And he disagrees with it. He thinks that slavery is natural, and he thinks also the subordination of women is natural, but not the equating of women and slaves. So Aristotle does make these distinctions within the hierarchy. So, and he says nature itself, or herself, distinguishes between females and slaves. Now, how does he make that claim? Well, as usual, Aristotle, he brings in, when he's talking about nature, he brings in his biology. And remember, with Aristotle, his biology is teleological. In other words, it's always got a telos involved, and a telos, remember, is like a goal or an end state. So why do acorns grow up into oak trees? The telos of the acorn is the oak tree. And so there is a kind of future state towards which the present is moving. We tend to use teleological explanations in our everyday lives. When you say, well, why did you do that? Well, because I wanted to bring something about. You know, I went and took a course in Aristotle because I wanted to get my degree and I needed the course, so that's why I'm doing it. That's a teleological type of explanation. So we often use teleological explanations in psychology, shall we say, but we don't really use them in physics or biology, where we say that the development of your, incisors or your teeth was for the sake of chewing. In evolutionary theory, we have sort of the other way of explaining it in terms of antecedent events leading up. And then if molars are produced, then they help an organism develop and survive, and so they are passed on in that sense. So in a way, we've got the more of a causal explanation. Aristotle has teleological explanations. So you always got to keep in mind that he's pulling in his understanding of biology. So when he says nature does it, always think, oh, Aristotle's understanding of nature, and it's the teleological understanding. All right, so with that in mind, there's another thing that Aristotle brings in with respect to nature. He says nature is, as a matter of fact, nature isn't the most efficient thing in Aristotle. Nature is the most excellent. It does things in a great way. It's got, an element of irrationality in it. He accepts that, and we'll see in a second why. But essentially, nature at its best really makes one thing for one purpose, right? So the best things in nature, the highest things, and nature is graduated. There are lower levels and higher levels of nature. The best things in nature are unipurpose things, right? Because they can do that They can discharge that function, that purpose that leads to that telos in the best way, rather than things that are multi-purposed. And Aristotle uses some examples that seem to indicate that when he says, if you have a certain kind of knife that cuts all kinds of things, it might do a reasonable job of cutting all different kinds of things, but the best kind of knife would be a knife that's specifically for cutting, like a bread knife versus a steak knife. So if you really want to cut your bread properly, you don't use a general all-purpose knife, you use a bread knife. But if you want to cut carrots, you don't use a bread knife for that. You use a chopping knife or something like that. So the best things are more unipurposed. And he applies that to human beings. So the best kind of human life is going to be, shall we say, kind of a narrower life than a human life where you're doing all kinds of things. And in this context, so that's the whole idea behind the Delphic knife that Aristotle talks about in this section of the Politics. So nature doesn't economize. Right? We tend to think of nature now as more of an economizer, right? Always seeking the shortest path and the simplest way. Kind of as Occam's razor. You want to understand nature, always, look at Occam's razor, take the simplest route. That is a way of thinking that we have often of nature today, but that's not the way Aristotle seems to have thought it. So nature aims at the best, and that means that it's some kind of purpose force has arranged things along this line. One thing, one purpose. That's the best way to do it. It's the highest and best way of organizing reality, but it's not the most economical. Now, slaves. Okay, so slaves are multifunctional. Now, we have to be careful with the notion of slavery in Aristotle, because when we use the term slave, we're probably going to have certain images that of slavery that may not be the way that Aristotle thought. So one thing that I just want to stress is that Aristotle is talking about slaves in the context of, and we'll see this in more detail in the next video, in terms of households. So these are small units, right? This is like what we would sort of traditionally, like the traditional nuclear family would have some slaves in it. So he's not talking about large operations. He would have been aware of large slave operations because the Spartans had a state-run slave system with their helots. So he's talking more about like private ownership of slaves and the ownership of slaves in terms of, so that's the commonality, is humans owning other humans. And that's, sort of the key moral problem of it. But Aristotle's talking about like sort of a smaller thing, not even like a village or like in the old American South where it'd be a large plantation where where a number of slaves would be working in a variety of areas. Aristotle's not really talking about that. That's more probably closer to the Spartan view of slavery. Aristotle seems to be, and I'm trying to stick to his discussion, that he's talking about it in terms of households. So what are slaves up to? What are they doing in the household? What did Aristotle say they did? Now, maybe this isn't perfectly historically correct. That's another story. But what did Aristotle think? Well, we'll look more in detail in the next video at that. But for now, slaves were multifunctional. They did a lot of things around the house. So they weren't like one thing, one purpose. They were like one thing, many purposes. So in that sense, they would have been lower down than the master and lower than the females in the household, because males and females, and in Aristotle's view, like the free ones, if females were really free, like free in a certain sense, more free than a slave, I guess. What were the females there for? Well, they weren't expected to do all the things around the house that a slave did. They weren't as multifunctional as one might think. Rather, as if you notice in the previous video when I talked about free Greek women, what were they supposed to do? Well, basically, they were to provide. They were to be involved in this, right? Reproduction. And so they would have these children, and the slaves would help and may probably do most of the work of looking after them. So it was, the women had this very narrow role. They fit this more than slaves did, right? So the one thing that women were there, they were there to have children. And so in that sense, they are ranked as higher in this biological, teleological structure of Aristotle's. So they had women had this very important, very narrow, very circumscribed duty of providing children. And now, this is, of course, very controversial, but that's more or less the way that Aristotle is trying to make these distinctions. So he's bringing in his view of biological principles. And so that starts for the why. Now, how do we get sort of the subordination of, men and women? Well, that's another topic of discussion, and again, very controversial. But it's another link to biology, right? Aristotle's view of biology. So the more we dig in, we can see, like, where does sort of just the simple prejudice come in, and where is it, some sort of reasoning and whatnot. So we try to sort of dig in to tease all this out. So how do we get the distinction between men and women and the subordination of women? Well, it seems that what was deeply puzzling for Aristotle was why you sometimes, like sex leads to pregnancy and pregnancy leads to offspring. Okay, he knew that, but he didn't know the details of it. Like, for instance, one thing that he puzzles over in his work, the Generation of Animals in Book 4, you can have a look at that. Aristotle is very puzzled as to why reproduction sometimes leads to males and sometimes it leads to females. Because all the antecedent events seem to be the same. So why do you sometimes get males and why do you get females? So, we may look at this and wonder, but why he's so puzzled? But remember, back then he had no idea of all the notions of biology that we have today. Aristotle didn't really understand what respiration was about. Even John Locke in the 1600s, there were philosophers, and John Locke was a doctor. He still didn't understand what breathing was about. There was debates on whether breathing was for cooling and heating the body or whatnot. They weren't really sure. So a lot of the biological notions and understanding that you may have while even learning in elementary school, those were beyond Aristotle's knowledge. All right, so Aristotle says, sometimes, so that's why Aristotle said, there seems to be a natural part of the species and a deviation from it. So he introduces that concept and says, naturally, and then this is probably where we say that the prioritization comes in, where the males are prioritized as the natural direction of the species, right? Humans are naturally males. And sometimes nature has to deviate from what's natural, and sometimes you get all kinds of creatures, but that's essentially where you get females. But it's a needed natural deviation. So that's probably where the prioritization is, because you could say, why isn't the female the natural and the male is the deviation? So we need the deviations if you postulate the notion of a natural type to a species, which Aristotle does, then you need a deviation in order to have reproduction. But again, you could have postulated either as the natural type. So what's the upshot of all this? Well, it's Aristotle's biology and his politics at this level is a mix of a whole bunch of things. Philosophical speculation, biological explanation, no doubt prejudices that he's inherited and seen. And of course, he wasn't unaware of other ways of understanding this. Not everybody agreed that males and females were different in the way that Aristotle thought. Not everybody agreed with something like this, or that this was the case, that there were natural rulers and natural ruled. So Aristotle is clearly aware of these other kinds of arguments. So here he's more or less laying out his description of the of natural pairs, and he hasn't really made totally the case for them. We'll look at that in a little bit later, in a later video. But this kind of argument that Aristotle brings in to support, these kinds of views that he's got here of reproduction and the ruler ruled in terms of preservation. Aristotle uses these kinds of arguments in a variety of other situations. It's analogous to the way he argues regarding things about evolution. Now, evolution was in a very rudimentary form, was introduced back in around Aristotle's time. He was aware of it. Some people, the Ionian philosopher Anaximander, who lived around 611, so quite a bit before Aristotle. And Aristotle was familiar with some of his work, and Anaximander said that the world was originally this undifferentiated kind of large substance that eventually things coalesced and emerged from it, and the earth was originally soaked, and it was kind of this big, mucky, muddy place, and creatures started emerging, coalescing out of the mud. And what's interesting is Anaximander did not think that humans were amongst those original creatures out of the mud, because Anaximander thought that some of the original creatures that came out of the mud, those original creatures changed into other creatures. And eventually humans we were like latecomers, or at least later. We weren't the original ones. And then eventually it seems that humans, Anaximander thought, may have come from fish. So he had a notion, not like full-on like natural selection and all this kind of stuff. He didn't have that. At least as far as I know, he didn't have a sophisticated Darwinian concept of survival of the fittest and all these things. But he had this idea that we might not have been first, and that we weren't created ex nihilo or anything like that. No, life comes from other living things, and eventually maybe life came from something inert, which is was a fascinating idea for that time. Now, what was Anaximander's evidence? Not really clear, but I just want to make a few comments that the ancients they were aware of fossils, not in the way that we are aware of fossils in terms of their stories, in terms of their scientific background that we would have now, but the ancients did collect them and did speculate that they might be the remains of earlier creatures that no longer existed. So other Ionian philosophers did, like Xenophanes of Colophon, talked about Anaximander's ideas and developed them a little bit more. And he thought these fossils some of the fossils that he found were, large lizards and he also concluded that some of the areas that were currently above water, used to be submerged. So there were some pretty interesting and rather sophisticated thoughts and speculations on fossils. So my whole point of this digression is that Aristotle is trying partially to provide some kind of scientific justification, but again, I think it's pretty clear that there's a lot of prejudices that have crept in. So Aristotle was relatively unconvinced. So just as a final note in this video, we should recognize that much later in book 1, I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, like towards the end, right at the end, that is chapter 13, Aristotle's very clear. He says that non-Greeks, they lack the deliberative element to them, that they're somehow different. They're lacking sort of this rational side of the soul. Women, however, he says, are not lacking this. Children, it's not fully developed. It comes later, which is why, as he said in the Nicomachean Ethics, children cannot be truly happy. They can experience pleasure, but they can't be truly happy. Aristotle in book 1, chapter 13, says that slaves really don't have a deliberative part of the soul, so they don't have really a natural ability to be rulers, so they fall into this category. They're naturally the ruled, and we'll look at that. Women, he says, they have certain abilities, rational abilities, but they're not complete, not authoritative, so they're sort of a lesser level than men. So they too can't live the full life of eudaimonia. All right. And so Aristotle also says that one of the elements, which is interesting, one of the elements of being a barbarian is that amongst barbarians is they don't have this proper notion. So in a society or a culture that's barbarian, they don't have the natural notion of ruler and ruled. They have people that are in charge, but it's not a natural distinction. It seems to be that Aristotle says in barbarian societies, it's just brute force that wins. And that's not a natural ruler, is brute force. He doesn't think so. It's more of the rational side of the soul that is the natural ruler. And that's, of course, as Aristotle thinks, that's the way that the Greeks follow. But the barbarians, they have no natural ruler group. It's just brawn over brains, if you like. So in that case, there is still a ruler and ruled, but not a natural ruler, just a brute force ruler. And Aristotle doesn't think that natural rulers are just brute force. The natural rulers are the ones who have higher levels of rationality. So brawn rules over everything in a barbarian society, and that's why barbarians don't distinguish between females and slaves. And Aristotle says it's a mark of, the higher Greek culture that they recognize this distinction of nature. So the Greek culture is more of a natural culture. So then it seems to follow, as if that all goes through, then Aristotle says, well, it just follows that we Greek males are higher levels of rationality, so we rule over the females, we rule over the slaves, and ultimately it would seem to follow that Greeks should rule over barbarians because Greeks are more rational. And in that sense, he tries to justify the social conditions in many ways that he found, right? As I talked earlier about the reforms of Solon in an earlier video, that they got rid of Greeks ruling over other Greeks and had Greeks enslaving foreigners. So in that sense, Aristotle's view certainly fit in. So it's a big mix, right? This is whole sort of a big mix of biological speculations, and they're clearly tinged with the cultural things that he grew up with and the prejudices that he would have encountered. So it's not completely straightforward, but you certainly can't say it's a strict rational account of things. No, he certainly was a person of his time, but that doesn't mean that in his time everybody would have agreed with this, because they didn't. There were people that, and we'll see in the next video, that there were some people that again said, no, this is not the case. There's no such thing as this natural kind of ruler and ruled. But that's topic for another video. Stay tuned.